Welcome back to Seek a Strength, and welcome back to the technical analysis of some very strong people. This one comes again from the comments, somebody we hadn't heard about from before. This is Rondel Hunte. So before we get going, if there's a lifter you want us to see, please post them in the comments, because it's great, because there's so much more people that will get exposed to when you guys know about them. You post them in the comments, because we're not going to be able to see everyone, and he has a lot of great points about his lifts, so it's phenomenal for everyone. So before we get going, please leave a lifter below if there's someone you think that would be good to look at in anything. So as we say, it's any sports, anything we want to look at, drop it below. We'll remind you again at the end, but just to get it going here. So we're going to start. He is a junior world record holder in the 105 kilo class in the IPF. So he did some incredible lifts. He's obviously several years older now, and looking at his most recent lifts from his Instagram, and he is an absolute monster. So we've got some huge lifts, but technically he is a great lifter. So some really nice points about his lifts. So we're going to start off with the squat. Take it away, Fitzy.
So the big thing that the kind of synonymous with IPF kind of lifters or modern power lifters and their squat is this idea of it's a low bar squat with high bar positions, right? His body is moving around as if it's in a high bar squat. I really like his squat here, right? He's very much in a low bar position. He very much uses the best possible low bar position for his leverages, but overall it's a very quad dominant squat. He's not massively wide with his feet. He's not massively posterior dominant by leaning back a lot or by pushing his hips back a lot. And it just makes for a very consistent and very powerful squat. Particularly when we looked at his lifts from competition, his lifts were very fast. They were very consistent. And the speed both that he's sitting down into the squat and standing back up and out of the squat is something I really like. So he's being fast enough where he's getting a nice bounce out of the bottom, but he's not being so fast where he kind of majorly loses position because of that speed at a drop.
So the thing I want to talk about in his squat is the lack of weightlifting shoes, and I actually very much like it for his lifting. So he squats in flats. I don't know if they look like boxing shoes to me, but I'm sure they could be some kind of deadlifting shoe. If there's Adidas, I imagine it's boxing or something. So there is a lot of people out there who are quite well built for squatting in terms of leverages, and his lower body is quite well built for that, who actually don't need that elevated heel from weightlifting shoes. I know some powerlifters call them squatting, and you can go to hell if you do. But the main thing is that you don't call weightlifting shoes squatting shoes.
Squat shoes?
That's the main thing you don't. So I really like that he doesn't use weightlifting shoes, because I don't think he actually needs that. The main benefit a lot of people get from weightlifting shoes is if their leverages aren't particularly favourable for that forward knee drive and that quad engagement. And the other aspect then is that hard sole of weightlifting shoes give you a lot of stability. Now, I would love if there was an option for people who squat in flats but with a stronger sole. You know, Vans, boxing shoes, deadlifting shoes and stuff like that are not ideal. Actually, the deadlifting shoes are probably, or those deadlift slippers you see people wearing, are probably a better option, because any amount of instability in the bottom will reduce some force output, and it's just not ideal. It's not as good as a very stable and hard surface at the bottom of your foot between you and the floor. So that's one thing I really like. I like the fact that he doesn't need them. Some people, if they're very well built for squatting, will actually feel a lot more quad engagement when they use flats as opposed to these higher heeled shoes. It'll also let him use his kind of lower body, his hips and his knees, which we talk about a lot, being engaged at the same time and maintain that similar timing. So if you're well built for squatting and you have a lot of forward knee travel capability, if you put on those weightlifting shoes, what I can often do is actually drag you forward and make you a little bit too anterior dominant, which in powerlifting, specifically in the squat, we want to make sure we're using our ass as well as our quads. We want to make sure we're using all this as much as possible. We might see some hip tuck or change in back angle if we're too forward dominant with those knees. So I really like that he has kind of made use of this flat-footed position. And it's definitely something to pay attention to yourself. You don't necessarily need weightlifting shoes. We see loads of people who do need them, but there is definitely people out there who could benefit from not using them. The other thing I want to talk about as well with his foot position is that he's just that kind of nice, slightly turned out position. We talked about in other videos where we really like that forward foot position, that kind of almost straightforward foot position, if you can do that. But there's a lot of people who can't use that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're just really harping on about, if you saw that mistakes, the video where we talked about mistakes in the back squat, where we talked about people turning out their toes too much. That's not to say we want everyone to have toes forward. There's this kind of nice in-between ground for a lot of people where those slightly turned out toes will give us that adequate kind of knee control and knee travel, and still give us that nice balance between our quads and, as I said, our ass.
One change I would like to see for Rondel, and this would be something, just a small technical change, if he was to bring his hands in slightly narrower, right? So at the moment, his hands quite wide. Low bar positions, we tend to see wider hands because biomechanically, if we're bringing the bar down further on our back, it's going to be more difficult to maintain a narrow position. Just one thing, when you see some of the heavier reps, you'll see the head coming forward, particularly in the juniors world championships. I think that he won, his head is quite forward and quite down, but even on some of the more recent videos where he's squatting heavier weights, his head and his upper back is moving around a small bit when he's squatting, and particularly in that kind of initial drive up out of the bottom position. I'd like to see hands a small bit narrower and just a bit more tension with the upper back, a bit more of a stacked upper back, and just see what that would do to change those positions.
So the heavy squat we've seen from seems to be 365 recently, so this was a few weeks ago, or 37 weeks ago, so I think that's the heaviest he's done for now. There's definitely a lot more in him, I would imagine. And I assume he's a lot heavier than 105 at the moment. He looks closer surely to 120.
He looks yacked.
Yeah. So next we'll move on to is the deadlift. So the heaviest deadlift we've seen, 838, which in actual numbers is something like 350 or so. No, that's more actually.
385?
Yeah, well, it was 350. So in real numbers, 838 is 350. So there's a lot of nice things about Rondel's deadlifts. A lot of them are just the very simple basic stuff, and it's great to see that they work all the way up to these heavier weights. My favourite aspect I think about his deadlift is the use of a dynamic start, but it's a very consistent and very simple dynamic start. So he just simply puts himself into that position that he wants to be in. So a position where his hips aren't too low, he's very stacked above the barbell, he's really tight, and he pulls himself into the barbell as he gets into the dynamic position, but it still uses his hips low enough where he can use as much leg drive as possible. Sometimes we see people use either no dynamic start, or we'll see a wildly extravagant, huge dynamic start with a lot of different variables, and this makes training repeatability something that's very, very hard to do. So we want repeatability for consistency and technique, and we want repeatability for the training of the same motor units and muscles and tendons and ligaments and all that good stuff involved in the deadlift. We want to make this as repeatable as possible, to train this as much as possible, to exploit this as much as possible, to force as much adaptability in this sequence of movements as possible. So when we're doing a dynamic start, it's very, very useful, especially in the deadlift. When we want as much force production from the floor as possible, dynamic starts are great for that, but it's very important that it's as consistent as possible. It's not knocking the barbell away from the floor or putting you in a bad position just for that extra force, which may not necessarily be useful towards the end of the lift.
One thing I really do like about his deadlift is, firstly, that it's conventional and it's an actual deadlift and not some other lift that people will consider to be the same as the deadlift, but mainly that he's double overhand and he's hook gripping, or I think he's hook gripping. I assume he's hook gripping.
Hook grip.
You see almost no twisting from side to side. You don't get that weird torquing that you'll see with a lot of lifters, particularly when they're kind of passing the knees and they're at their kind of most inclined over position. Oftentimes you'll see that bit of a twist. I really like his deadlift because he is so consistent. He's so equal from side to side, or even from side to side. There's very little difference from side to side, and I think a lot of that is coming from the fact that he's double overhand hook gripping and not getting one side more than the other, as you'd often have with the mixed grip.
So moving on then to his bench press as well, he's got the trifecta, he's got the golden star, he's got the triple crown. All of his lifts have very, very good technique, and a lot of good aspects from these that you can take away from them. Probably my favourite part of his deadlift, or the favourite aspect of his deadlift, I think, is the stacking at the bottom of the bench press, and then this kind of vertical forearm for as much of the bench press as possible. So a big thing we'll see with beginners and a lot of people who are kind of benching the lower weights is we'll see either a very inward position as they get to the bottom, or they'll hit the bottom, they'll have a stacked wrist position, so this will be straight. This angle here will be kind of like a nice straight wrist position, but then as soon as they begin to press, we see a huge amount of flare out. So not necessarily concerned about the elbow flare in terms of injury risk. I don't know if it's more or less, and it'd be kind of hard to say, but I would be concerned about it in regards to maximum positions and best pressing positions. So typically what you want to see is this vertical forearm stacked at the bottom, and then this forearm stacked for as long as you possibly can before we see some of that kind of elbow flare of the shoulder. So really like is that he's really stacked at the bottom, and then as he begins pressing, there's a nice smooth opening of that angle until he gets to the lockout. So I really like that he is consistent with that, even at heavier weights. So sometimes you'll see lifters, they'll have good positions up until like 80% and then as they get heavier, we'll see a lot more flare, where his consistency with repetitions, you know, at 500 pound deadlifts is very consistent.
Yeah, it's an incredibly strong bench press he has. So like it's very fast off his chest. Definitely the thing I admire most about his bench press is the fact that it's no crazy arch, no crazy setup, not a crazy wide grip. Now his grip is wide, but he's also a very wide individual. He's massive by the looks of it, very wide shoulders, long arms. So his setup is very kind of standard in its setup. He doesn't have the big arch. His legs are set on the floor. He's developing a lot of tension in his legs and his hips, but he's by no means getting into this like crazy big arch position where he's limiting range of motion. I think that leads to a very trainable position, and a position when you're training with it that will yield you a lot of very good results, but also a position that can be very easily replicated in competition. And that's definitely something I think a lot of powerlifters miss out on, is they'll really over rely on the competition bench, and they'll end up doing some of their prep phase maybe with a close grip bench, or they'll do some dumbbell benching. They'll really over rely on that competition bench. I think if you are closer to a training bench technique, as you get to competition, you're going to be better off, just in terms of long-term progression, using the bench press to make the bench press better over a long period of time.
Speaking of the bench press, our bench press program will be out very soon. So we had the press program and we could run it for the bench press. A lot of people did do that, but we have a bench specific with a lot higher frequency and more specific bench work coming out soon. He benched 252 kilos. This is 252.
That's insane.
That's mental, with bumper plates as well. I wonder, does the weight make much difference at those weights? Does it even matter?
It's kind of slow enough where it may not make any difference.
I bet there's
insane.
Bet there's powerlifters out there who complain about benching 120 and that kind of bench.
Yeah.
So hope you enjoyed the video. Just to reiterate, if there's lifters, there's so many strong people out there, you just can't possibly know all of them. So if there's people you want us to look at, please leave it in the comments. We'll definitely take a look at those, because there's always some great videos from that. So we really appreciate it.